Well, thank you all for coming back from a lunch, and hopefully I am not going to depress you too much with the topic of today. We've obviously been hearing a lot about the importance of trade on global growth and on the outlook for the global economy moving forward. The World Bank just came out with a report that's revising its forecast of global trade growth in 2019. It's expected to hit around 2.6%, which is a low not seen since the global financial crisis. Christine Lagarde just yesterday warned that rising tariffs between the US and China were self-inflicted wounds that would hit the already precarious global recovery. And then earlier today, in the keynote remarks by Deputy Prime Minister Aso, he mentioned the importance of multilateralism in trade, and in an earlier interview in the FT, just earlier this week, he said, when you're talking about the overall trade balance, you have to think multilaterally, not bilaterally. And the G20 is a great forum for that. So, in today's panel, we're obviously going to be touching on a lot of different issues, and one of them is the US-China trade war, but, also very important to think about the broader trends in the global trading system, and that there's actually more to trade than just the US-China trade war, though headlines may suggest otherwise. So with that, I have kind of three main goals for the session, and then I'll turn it over to the panel. Number one is, please, audience engagement is welcome. You have the app, and I have the iPad, so please feel free to ask any questions. Number two, I'm going to try to focus the discussion some on some of the multilateral trade discussions, as I mentioned. And number three, which is what we'll start with, we're going to try to solve the US-China trade war. So, we only have 50 minutes, so we'll have to move really quickly, but I have faith. So with that, let's dive into US-China trade and take it from there. So I actually just got back from Shanghai last night. I've been there for the past couple of days. And one of the topics that just kept coming up, obviously, was what is the Trump administration's strategy with regard to the US-China trade war? What is he trying to achieve? Is there even a strategy? And I have my own suspicions about whether there's a strategy or not. But Faryar, not to put you on the spot, but do you think that there's an actual kind of strategy here? Is there an end goal that you think President Trump and the administration has?
Yeah, I think there is. I think the best way to understand what the administration is trying to do on China is to take it at face value. They have laid out quite comprehensively through a speech that Vice President Pence gave last year a broader set of concerns about China, but then through the process at USTR in the 301 report, much more specific articulation about areas in which the US views China, both on the areas of market access, but more fundamentally in the area of IP protection, tech transfer, and what have you, where the US views that there's problems in terms of China's exercise of unfair trade practices. So in an interesting way, for all the uncertainty people have about what the objectives of the administration are, they're quite well documented and articulated, perhaps more so than in any other area of administration policy that you could find. And I think, again, in the spirit of taking things at face value, they've documented the concerns. The presidents of the two countries have directed their negotiators to try to resolve the problems that arise from those differences. The US has imposed a lot of tariffs as a way to get leverage in those negotiations, and then the discussions have ensued. The discussions by their nature are quite hard. I mean, for those of us who are involved in the US, in China's accession negotiations into the WTO, there were big dramatic breakdowns at the end before they finally reached a deal. So that, the complicated nature of the path from where they started to where they're hoping to end up is not unusual. So we'll see where they end up, but I feel like we have to take it at face value. They'll reach an agreement, hopefully, and put it behind them.
Okay. Yeah. No, it's a good point. But I think also when you think about things like the trade war and the threat of tariffs that have now come out on Mexico, and combating a kind of perceived immigration crisis. I would think that many countries would be increasingly wary of signing any sort of trade agreement with the United States, especially seeing how these negotiations, granted, there's always ups and downs, you get close, you step apart, but, it's certainly been a real roller coaster ride. So, Deborah, maybe I'll turn it over to you. What are your thoughts on, would it be strange for a country to say, you know what, I'm not interested in signing a trade agreement with the United States because I don't actually know what I'm going to get?
Well, I think it's always been hard to figure out the end game for U.S.-China because, it's a long list of things the U.S. wants China to do. There's almost nothing that the United States is going to do in return. So this is not really a negotiation in the classic sense where you're coming together on a compromise position. That's hard. So it's very hard to figure out how are you going to sell this in both communities to say it's win-win. In Asia we like win-win. This was never really going to be a win-win. You had to have, but it was even harder because the U.S. side said, well, why we shouldn't give anything. We haven't been the one cheating. It's going to have to be a sort of, we win and you don't. That's really hard. And then it's gotten more complicated over time, and the more complicated it's gotten, the harder it is to see how you get an outcome. But compounding that, as if we didn't need more challenges, the breakdown in communications, I think, is difficult. But then I would say the Mexico thing really is an important problem. And the reason why Mexico, if you weren't paying attention to the Mexico tariff discussion from last weekend, is super important, and certainly the Chinese, if they're not paying attention, they should be, is because the Trump administration has now started using trade tools for non-trade purposes. So this is 5% across the board tariffs starting on Monday on Mexico for a migration problem. Now, why is that an issue for everyone else, including, I would argue, for Japan, Europe, and elsewhere? Because this is a violation of U.S. commitments, I would argue, in at least three areas. Their WTO commitments, their NAFTA commitments to Mexico, their upcoming, what the United States calls USMCA, or NAFTA 2.0 commitments. So 3 different ways the U.S. and Mexico have existing relationships that are undermined by this threat for tariff increases for migration purposes. It also, there's still debate about this, but I think the evidence will show that the United States is using a domestic tool that was never intended for this purpose. So it's not even justified under U.S. domestic law. So it's just a flat-out violation of lots of things. And I think if I was China, I would say, well, why would I trust any past agreement or future agreement with the United States if all of a sudden a non-trade concern or a trade concern or whatever, I don't know what, the man gets up, Donald Trump gets up and he doesn't like the shape of his tie in the morning and he says, that's it, I'm raising tariffs on whatever, Chinese goods, or I'm going to do, I don't know what. I think China has to be very wary of signing an agreement. And I think it's not just China. I think it's every country that wants to sign an agreement with this administration has to think twice after this last weekend on Mexico. Even if Mexico manages to resolve the current problem on immigration, I think it's still a challenge because it says that this administration will not be bound by past commitments on trade.
Well, hopefully.
I'm sorry. I'm normally an optimist. I like to be an optimist.
I just hope that whatever color tie he puts on next doesn't really set him off, because we can't really afford too many more trade battles. But Tomoko, both of Faryar and Deborah, point out that there's something more here to the U.S.-China trade war than just U.S. and just China. And so, what are you seeing or feeling here in the Asia-Pacific region, obviously in Japan, but more broadly in the region? What are some of the spillover effects? Do you think they have a sort of, is it a long-term spillover effect? Do you think this is something that will, kind of rectify or right itself at a certain point?
Yeah, with regard to negative spillover effect, is huge actually, and Japan has already felt the huge impact of negative spillover between U.S.-China trade disputes. And before I go into the spillover effect, let me begin with the 3 notable features of the current global economic landscape: globalization and technology, digital economy, and the third is China. And the recent situation reminds me of the words of Napoleon Bonaparte. So China is a sleeping lion, and let her sleep. When she wakes, the world will be shaken. And now China waked up, and the world is shaking. And the central issue is now how to live with that lion in the small cage of the globe. And the Chinese economy has grown to 16% to the world GDP in nominal terms, compared with 4%, just 4% in 2001 when China joined the WTO. And whereas the US GDP accounts for 24% in the world. So in total, 40% of world GDP fighting each other is big enough to make the global economy tremble. And so I heard some people talking about, say, containment or say, decoupling of China. But from the viewpoint of an economist, these are not sensible at all. And contain, it is too large, 1.4 billion people, much larger than the former Soviet Union. And say, decoupling, China is too attractive for the business to give up. So probably the best, say, solution or realistic approach is to stick to, say, integrate them into the world economic system, which has brought us great prosperity for 70 years since the end of the World War II. By pushing them, so pushing their reforms, say, on various fronts, including say, subsidies and SOEs. So the main objective is to push forward their reform. And so the issue is now how to do it. And suddenly, it's not tariff. As far as I have observed, tariff imposing is neither a good solution nor a good weapon to threat and push reforms. And because it is harmful for not only both countries, but also the global economy as a whole by slowing down the trade, disrupting global value chains, and lowering business confidence and market confidence as well. So the Japanese economy has already suffered from the negative spillover effect of US-China tariff war escalation by a significant slowdown in exports for Asia and thereby a weak industrial production. And some economists might talk the third-party gains based on theory, namely two dogs fight for a bone and the third run away with it. But at least in Japan, I haven't seen any third dog in macroeconomic
So
indicators.
no one has the bone yet?
No, not at all.
All right. And, you know, to that point, talking about some of the economic impacts of the trade dispute, broadly speaking, you know, Bob, a lot of people have said that, you know, trade conflicts, it's not necessarily the tit-for-tat sort of tariffs that are as worrying as some of, you know, how it could weigh on businesses and consumer sentiment and spending. And, you know, are you already seeing these trends? And if so, you know, do you think that there's lasting damage being done? Or again, do you think there's a way to kind of come out of this?
Well, the latest data suggests that investment is weaker than it otherwise was expected to be. It's not negative, but slower than expected. That's a very bad sign for near-term and long-term growth. Consumers, so far, have been holding fairly steady, but that could change also. Most people are focused on the direct effects of the tariffs, as you said. We are much more concerned at the IMF, World Bank, WTO, OECD, We're much more concerned about the indirect effects on business confidence and consumer confidence. The direct effects are likely to be small. You get a lot of trade diversion. We already see that happening. We see other countries gaining. Interestingly, the trade conflict between the US and China was benefiting Mexico, as well as Vietnam and other Asian countries. But things will move around, be a little bit less efficient, and the efficiency losses are pretty small. But once you start affecting investment, that has pretty significant direct effects on GDP growth. But keep in mind, you can offset some of those effects. So what do we see happening? We hear about the Fed easing off on interest rates. The European Central Bank has eased off on interest rates. Stimulus, fiscal policy stimulus can offset some of these effects. So you can hide the near-term effects of these trade policies, but you're going to leave behind a fingerprint or even a deep footprint of higher cost production, fragmented trading system where countries are not letting the most efficient supply chains arise, but instead they'll be maybe more regionalized. That could be have significant long-term drag on economic growth.
Right. And turning over to there was a question from the audience here, and it was on kind of the nature of the U.S.-China trade dispute, and the question was, is it really more about, it's not just about trade, right? There's more to this conflict. This is more of an existential sort of great power rivalry. The U.S. will never be able to kind of let China ascend in a way that, China thinks it's right and should be able to do. So do you see this as almost a proxy war for a bigger, Cold War light, if you will?
I don't know. I think we'll only know the answer to that question over time. But I do think, as I said at the outset, the way I best understand what's happening is to take everything at face value. And so I think there's a list of trade issues that the administration has identified that they want to get addressed in the negotiations or the mechanism by which they are trying to address it. I do think the vice president's speech that I mentioned is actually responsive to your question.
Right.
And I think it gets to Tomoko's point in terms of what exactly is happening here. I think the strategy vis-a-vis China, and I'm speaking as somebody who worked in the previous administration, I think the global strategy around China has been to integrate China into the global institutions and the global rules-based system, and that as it enters and inhabits those institutions, it begins to adopt the habits of the Western democracies, rule of law, transparency, democratic institutions, and what have you. I think what the Mike Pence speech would tell you, and I think this is a bipartisan consensus in the United States, but it's also, I think, an increasing view in Europe, is that strategy of integration to deal with, as the way to deal with the problems, is insufficient. You can integrate China, but you also have to deal with the problems as they arise on the trade front, but also on the national security front, on the intel front, on the cyber front, and the rest. So I think the strategy is less about, it's not a trade-only issue, but it's also not necessarily, although we don't know, for those of us who are on the outside of government, we don't know. It's also not a, let's try to isolate and put China in a box. I think it's something in between, which is respond in each area where there's overreach by China, and respond aggressively, not counting on the course of time to solve it.
Right.
And I think that's the way, at least I think about it in terms of what's happening.
Great. And I think we'll talk maybe a little bit more later about kind of national security and investment and economic strategy. But I wanted to kind of move into not necessarily an existential question, but what do we all think constitutes a good, quote unquote, good trade agreement? And what should be the role, if any, of things like currency in trade agreements and currency provisions? I mean, we've had recently 3 different trade agreements that have had 3 different ways of addressing currency. So you had the amended Core Steel, which had currency understandings, which weren't published, so we don't really know what those currency understandings were. We had the original TPP, which had a joint declaration of the macroeconomic policy authorities, which, though it dealt with currency, it was legally separate from the actual trade agreement itself and was negotiated separately. But then we have the NAFTA 2.0, the USMCA, which included currency provisions actually inside the agreement itself. And this was really precedent setting. And I guess the question is that a good precedent to set? Again, I have my own thoughts on that, but, Deborah, it would be great to get your views, and then Tomoko, if you have some thoughts on that as well.
If I can just make one point on the previous question first.
Sure.
So, it might be worthwhile for this audience, if you haven't seen it already. Singapore's Prime Minister Lee just had a great speech last weekend at the Shangri-La Dialogue on U.S.-China relations, which I think is worth reading. In fact, we just did because we found it so useful, actually, we've just done a double blog post on our Talking Trade blog to highlight excerpts from his speech, in which he highlights the difficulties both sides are having in a fairly clear-eyed way, I think, in assessing the changing nature of this relationship. And so I recommend that all of you read his speech, because I think it's worth taking a look at. Currency. Okay, so this is going to sound unpopular to people who like currency agreements in a trade agreement, but I, as a trade person, dislike non-trade things in a trade agreement. I think it is hard enough to get an agreement on trade to begin with. And the history of recent trade negotiations suggests that they're hard to conclude. They're difficult, they're long, there's a lot of stakeholders that you need to consult. The more non-trade things that you pack into a trade agreement, the harder it is to get to resolution, and the harder it is to get a trade agreement that does what I think a trade agreement is supposed to do, which is deliver trade and results for companies that then benefit companies, which benefit, I would argue, consumers and others in society. So I am not a fan of sticking in currency provisions in a trade agreement, because I think that is a non-core issue. Now, we can argue about whether currency has an issue on trade, yes. Labor has an issue on trade, yes. Environment has an issue on trade, yes. So we could put a lot of things in a trade agreement, but every time you add a new thing to a trade agreement, you make it harder to get a trade agreement done. You make it harder to get it through whatever the domestic procedures are. You make it harder to get it implemented. And currency is one of those that is going to be impossible to implement effectively. Everyone is going to dislike the outcome. So my preference would be don't go there. But I know it's hard because, you've got this like sort of Christmas tree, right? And you can just put lots of things on it. And the more that everyone wants the Christmas tree decorated their way, the more they want to put stuff on there. And it's a ready-made vehicle for doing whatever you want. And so people are like, this is a great thing. Let's put more stuff on my Christmas tree. And suddenly the whole thing will topple over. And so I would say don't put currency in a trade agreement. The best ones, to me, are the ones that deal with, again, the basics. Goods, services, investment, intellectual property rights, especially digital rules, et cetera. Like, let's focus on that. Let someone else, I don't know, that's what you people in the IMF and elsewhere, you deal with currency. You fix that. Let the finance people, you deal with currency. Don't let us trade people have to deal with that.
Tomoko, what are you? Do you have a similar view to that?
Yes, currency provision.
The Christmas tree.
Christmas tree. We should exclude currency provision from the Christmas tree. Yes, definitely. My position is clear. The currency provision should not be included in trade talks. Perhaps there are two reasons. One is foreign exchange is used for export and imports, but also for investment. So daily transactions of foreign exchange for investment is much, much larger than transactions for trading goods. So therefore, I do not see any point in including currency provision in agreements on trading goods. The second thing is, yes, with regard to Japan, trade balance with Japan is almost balanced now. And the majority of current balance surplus comes from surplus of investment income, both in portfolio investment and direct investment. And trade balance of Japan, trade balance of goods in Japan Yes, we have surplus with the US and UK, but we have great deficit with Saudi Arabia, Canada, Australia, Italy, and France. And balance of service trade, yes, we have surplus with China, but we have great deficit of service trade with US. So I do not see any point in focusing on bilateral balance.
Right.
And rather, as a global imbalance is matter, but we have division of labor in the world. That's the world works. So I do not see any point in focusing on just bilateral trade matters. And of course, we should exclude currency provision from the trade talks.
Well, and Bob and Faryar, I don't mean to exclude you from this particular discussion. You know, what are your thoughts? Are they similar to Deborah's and Tomoko's, or do we have any naysayers on the panel?
No, I think a few years ago I was tasked with looking at the different ways to calculate optimal exchange rates, and there was discussion about legislation that might require an agency I worked with to look into this. It never happened. But when we looked into this, what we found was they're very sensitive to different assumptions, right? So, you know, if you're trying to judge whether a currency is misaligned, a lot depends on the approach you use to calculate what the equilibrium rate would be. But even more importantly, I think, don't try to use trade policy to solve things that are really not trade related. Currencies do have an effect on trade, you know, not necessarily as theory would like, and I think there's been some important work done by the chief economist at the IMF that shows that the US dollar has a very special role in global trade, and that affects countries' ability to have exchange rates affect trade balances. But there are other things, savings and investment. You know, I've been looking at trade policy for most of my career. I think freer trade liberalization has big positive benefits, but not as big as many trade policy proponents like to think. You still have to pay attention to your domestic policy. You need to take care of your institutions, invest in your infrastructure, educate your people. These are all very, very important things. And when I look at the views on China, many people, I think, attribute too much to China's success on the trade front and don't necessarily look at the other aspects. And then for those that are concerned about the rise of China, they're not necessarily doing enough domestic reflection about what they haven't done well domestically. There's still the trade issues that have to be resolved, but trade issues are not going to fix this. You know, tariffs are not the right tool to address these kinds of issues. It might be a good tool to get people's attention, right, but the solution is likely to come in other areas.
So you need to actually look in your own backyard before.
You ought to do both, right? You ought to take care of what you can take care of domestically, what you have more influence and control over, and you also need to have those clear-eyed conversations with other countries where you think that they may be not meeting their obligations. I do have one of my favorite things to say, since I joined the WTO about 5 years ago, is every WTO member lives in a glass house, right? They should be careful about throwing stones because every WTO member has things that other WTO members feel they're not meeting their obligations on. But that's why you should come together and discuss and negotiate rather than start throwing stones.
Sure, yeah. Faryar, anything to add on this?
I think if you built a perfect trade agreement, you would have somebody like Bob build a general equilibrium model of the current kind of state of the economy, and then figure out what the nature of an agreement would be that would maximize GDP growth based on the proportion of the economy and flows that curb cross borders and the degree of liberalization that would maximize GDP growth. And for those of us who've been in the political process, there's zero agreements that would ever meet that. When I was on the Hill and Bob was the chief economist at the ITC, we the administration would negotiate trade agreements. People like me would try to get them passed. But in the U.S., before any of that would happen, Bob and his team at the ITC, at the U.S. International Trade Commission, would do an analysis of the GDP impact. And if we ever got a report back from the ITC that said that there was even a smidgen of an incremental net benefit to GDP growth of a trade agreement, we would all, pop champagne corks because
Didn't share that with me.
because that was often not what the net result was of the economic impact. And so the reality is, if raspberries are politically potent, then your next trade agreement better have huge market access advances for raspberries, notwithstanding the fact that financial services might be a way more important part of the economy. You're seeing it in the Brexit negotiations, the relative proportion of attention paid to, I won't name the sector so I don't get quoted on it, but one sector over another, measured against the relative contribution to GDP, and the mismatch is stark. So I think the right answer is the right trade agreement is the agreement that achieves liberalization in sufficient areas that makes the economic and trade relationship stable for the foreseeable future. I think that's a good way to think about it, which then facilitates a more efficient allocation of labor and capital in the economies and encourages investment. That sounds like a bunch of mumbo jumbo, but I think I think Bob would probably agree with that.
I agree, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that's just the reality, and it aligns with the politics of what drives trade agreements in the end of the day.
Well, I feel good about this. I think we pretty much solved things. But given that we're in Japan and in the Asia Pacific more broadly, there's lots to talk about aside just the bilateral trade agreements. And Japan has been playing such a leading role in some of the multilateral trade agreements. And talk a little bit about how you see Japan's role in this and moving forward. Tomoko, if you have some thoughts.
Yes, Japan has had a greater role of trade agreement, in particular multilateral front like TPP 11 and EU, Japan, FTA as well. And so because we believe FTAs or this kind of trade agreements have benefited the economy, creating jobs and realizing the most efficient location of production, which business continues to pursue. And the recent situation of the global economy actually provide great opportunities for global growth. If we look at, say, the picture from the long perspectives, like super long perspectives, like say the OECD economic historians study on 1,000-year economic history revealed there are three conditions for high economic global growth in 1,000 years in economic history, and three conditions. One is technological innovation, like industrial revolution. Second is frontiers for economic activities, like finding the new world. The third, greater mobility and greater trade flows and investment, like steamboats. And does the current global economic situation fulfill these conditions? Yes, we have the fourth industrial revolution. Yes, we have frontiers for economic activities, growth in emerging markets, and perhaps China. And the third, we have greater mobility in goods and services, and also greater mobility of information and data. So keeping free trade and investment is critical to maximize the benefits from these great opportunities in the world. That's what I believe. Yeah.
Well, building off that and the issue of the free flow of data, cross-border e-commerce has generated, like you said, trillions of dollars in economic activity, and the ability to move data really has underpinned new business models and really boosted GDP growth. However, there are obviously still digital trade barriers. including outdated regulations, fragmentations, strict data localization rules in some areas, and that can really potentially hamper these gains. And I know, Deborah, the Asia Trade Center has been thinking about digital trade and these issues for a while. You know, what are some of your thoughts, and what are some of the developments that we should really be paying attention to in this area?
That's a great question. So we do work on digital. When we don't do global trade problems, we're doing a lot on digital. We've been doing digital around, especially RCEP. So the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership has been going on since the end of 2012. We started doing RCEP discussions in the e-commerce/digital space with these 16 countries. Japan is one of them. 10 countries in ASEAN: China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand. 17 rounds ago is when we started going. And we've been every round since then, so this feels like it's been forever. And the reason why we started doing that is we said Asia should be at the leading edge of the digital/e-commerce space. This should be the easiest place to land decent, we're not hugely ambitious, but decent rules on this e-commerce space in particular. Let's try to be ambitious. Let's try to think about what do small businesses need and try to promote those kinds of rules. Now, this has gotten very complicated, sadly, because not actually China. So many people say, oh, it must be China that's killing you. No, it's actually ASEAN that's killing us. So it's Indonesia on data localization is a nightmare. Vietnam on our cybersecurity law is a problem. Indonesia, again, on the customs moratorium, where they want to start putting digital duties and customs barriers on digital services that get delivered into Indonesia. So we've had to have a whole program around that. India has got the most, if you're not paying attention to India in their e-commerce and digital space, you should be, because this is a disaster. So India is really bad. And in fact, while I have the thing and I'm talking for a second, you should really be paying attention to India and US-India. I know we were talking earlier at the panel before lunch and they said not to worry about India and trade. Big mistake. I think US is lined up for a Section 301 on India, which is what they've done to China. So it's unfair trade practices against India. I expect it any time. So that's not out of the woods in India. But India also on digital and e-commerce has a truly wretched set of policies that are coming now that the election is over. So we have a number of governments in this region that are pursuing backwards policies on e-commerce and digital, despite Asia being very forward-leaning and very progressive, digitally connected, mobile savvy, e-commerce heavy. So it's been a sort of, forward and yet backwards in Asia. And it's very difficult to get government to see why this matters. So we're trying to get companies especially to explain what they do, how they do it, why it matters, to get better policies in the region. And it's been difficult. I'll tell you why it's been done. This is my last point. It's been difficult because this is the kind of, and I'm not suggesting that all government regulators are stupid. That is not my point. But we often have,
there's probably a few.
There's a number of them here. But often when we have these discussions about things like the cloud, I swear to you that they turn and they look out the window and they go, well, where is my data? And they look for a literal cloud in the sky. And you say, oh yeah, how are we going to make good regulations if we're looking for clouds in the sky? So this is the problem that we are facing. We need more government and company interaction around digital and data issues in order for governments who are regulating in this space to see why it matters to their own economy and to their own small businesses especially, because otherwise we're going to end up with a mess here in Asia, which will be a mess globally.
Right. And Bob, obviously, in addition to the Asia Trade Center, the WTO has been looking at these issues quite closely. And I think just last month there was a plurilateral on e-commerce in the WTO. How are you seeing kind of digital trade barriers and the future of digital trade? Are similar sorts of issues that Deborah brought up, or are there other things we should be concerned about?
I think Deborah illustrated that there are a number of WTO members that have different views on this. And so we have a shocking development. But there are a group of members that have formed this joint initiative around e-commerce, and they're very serious about it, and they're taking it forward. It is open to other members that may want to join in and potentially influence those negotiations. But So there is a group that wants to move forward and set up a set of rules around certain areas. There are other members that are concerned about things like the moratorium on electronic transmissions, moratorium of duties on electronic transmissions. The interesting thing here is this is a fast-moving area. We think it's very important that rules start being made and that firms and customers, consumers, have a good understanding of what is going to be expected of them in this marketplace. But it is going to be very, very difficult to get all WTO members to agree on any particular strategy. But a group going forward is we think, is a positive thing, and hopefully they'll make good progress. We see some of these issues being addressed in regional trade agreements, and that's very helpful. One of the very positive things about the USMCA was the way it addressed the digital economy. So there's a lot to potentially draw from in terms of experience out there. And we think members a large number of members are very serious about it. But the attraction, I have to say, the attraction of industrial policy and protectionism it's a very strong attraction. And it's something that's very difficult to argue from a technical economic perspective that you're going to incur these costs by doing this. One of the interesting things we had around this electronic transmissions discussion was the general equilibrium effect of putting tariffs on these electronic transmissions and the impact on the domestic economy and revenues and consumer well-being. That's not at all what governments are necessarily thinking about. They're thinking about, we want revenue.
Right.
And other economists would say, well, there's more efficient ways to get the revenue that you want. But the border is something that many countries feel they have pretty tight control over.
Sure. Well, we just have a few minutes left, so I think a sort of broad question for the group, and it's sort of one of the things I started off with. Generally speaking, are we optimistic or pessimistic about the future of global trade, or are we optimistic maybe here in the Asia Pacific region and pessimistic more broadly, or let's do a quick thumbs up, thumbs down. Faryar, let's start with you.
I think in the short term, we're in a period of turbulence as the world is adapting to the new sort of trade dynamics that we're all observing. I think long term, though, it's inevitable more trade flows will occur. It's just the nature of the world between technology and other sort of advances. People are going to want to trade across borders. So that feels inevitable to me, but it'll be a bit of a bumpy road till we get there.
Okay. Bob?
I agree. I think we have some short-term disruption. Could be very costly, very painful, and a slow recovery. But I think when one looks at technological change, one looks at developments in education, I just think that there's going to be more integration, more trade, different forms. Some of it could be digital, might be less movement of basic goods, but I see it very difficult to turn around the global integration we've seen, particularly around the movement of goods and services.
Tomoko?
Yes, the most important role of the government is to change pessimism to optimism. And so first, may I suggest three things. One is to maximize the benefit of globalization, it is really important to emphasize on the role of WTO and the WTO reform for strengthening its function and enforcement of rules. And the second thing I'd like to suggest is domestic policy settings must be upgraded for adapting the new, world or new global reality, like, distribution policy, labor market policy, re-education, and vocational training for workers. These things are critically important for the future of trade. And the third thing, I'd like to re-emphasize on the fundamental values we share, that is freedom and liberty, or say liberté, égalité, fraternité in French. So the size of GDP, yes, perhaps China will surpass the US GDP in the coming 10 years or so, but the size of GDP is different, far different from the leadership. And the leader must advocate the value, common value, which other countries are willing to follow and share. And so I believe, these values and promoting these greatest values the humankind created makes the country truly great.
And Deborah, last word.
Well, professionally, it's fantastic when trade is at the top of all of your lists. That's fantastic. But personally, I go to bed depressed a lot of nights. So it's a mixed bag when you're making trade great again, I guess.
We'll make hats that say that.
Yes, yeah, we have hats coming.
Well, with that, that brings us to the end of this session. Please join me in thanking the panel.